Hey, everybody, welcome back to the next episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. My name is Colin LeBeau, president here at Fox Hire, an employer of record platform here in the US. And I've got two great people from my team, Jamie Henry and Julie Majors, here to talk everything EOR RFP. How are you guys?
I'm
Doing
good.
great,
How are you?
thanks.
Doing well, thanks. We've taken a little bit of a break over the last couple months, and we're back talking about one of the things we've been working on quite a lot recently, which is responding to EOR RFPs. And we felt like this would be a great topic to share with our audience and EOR buyers, sellers of staffing services, anybody that might be participating or care about an RFP. So I thought I could kick off by just introducing ourselves and why we might have some information on this. So, Julie, would you mind just introducing yourself and your role here at Fox Hire, and then we'll jump to Jamie.
Sure. My name is Julie Majors, and I'm the contracts manager for Fox Hire. What my role involves is reviewing all of the contracts that we set up with our client companies that we partner with, that we provide the EOR services to. So if we need to negotiate any terms or we need to set up some special onboarding requirements, I head that up. And I also review all of the RFPs that we're working on and help coordinate the responses and get that data from our team members and ensure that we get the RFP submitted accurately.
Perfect. You've done quite a few RFPs in your time. How many RFPs do you think, if you could guess, that you've responded to?
I would guess I'm approaching the 100 mark pretty soon.
Okay. Yeah, quite a few. Lots of Excel boxes to fill in, lots of answers provided. So
Certainly.
appreciate that experience. What about you, Jamie? Could you maybe just introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jamie Henry. I'm the Director of Operations and Healthcare Services here at Fox Hire. I work very closely with Julie when it comes to working on RFPs. She typically provides great direction for our teams, makes sure that we know exactly what's needed. So I will oversee the completion of responses related to things like compliance and setup and really working with prospective clients around understanding what specifically they need, and then ensuring that in our responses, we're addressing how we would go about meeting those needs, identifying any gaps in our services, et cetera, and ensuring that those are all clearly communicated in our response to that RFP. I don't have nearly as much experience as Julie. I think I've done about 10 major RFPs or so in the past, really the past 2 to 3 years is where we've seen a pretty significant influx in the request for RFP. And so I've had the opportunity to work closely with Julie throughout that process and learn from her and really kind of refined how we handle those and how quickly we can turn them around.
Perfect. Yes, appreciate that experience as well. So if you are a buyer of EOR or staffing services, you're in the right place. The purpose of this episode is to talk about the questions you should be asking during your RFP process, and how you should ask them, why you should ask them, some of the common ones that we might face, those types of things. So if you are a buyer of staffing or EOR services, this is going to be a great value to you. But if you're a seller of staffing or EOR services, this could also be helpful to you in understanding why some of these questions are asked and their importance. So I guess first question is, Julie, done all these RFPs in the past. How many questions are typically asked during an RFP that the vendors are required to answer? Just ballpark.
I would say the shortest RFP I've ever seen was potentially 30 questions, and I would say 300 is probably the longest one I've seen. So
Please
um,
don't send us 300
it
questions.
runs.
Yes. Okay, so big swath there. And some buyers are more particular than others. Maybe there's reasons why there's more questions, like it's government contract, or maybe it's in a very high risk area like healthcare or education, things like that, which require a little bit more specific information. But what are some of the general areas that you see the questions being asked in? Like, what are the topics?
I see a lot of questions about compliance, about the EOR's history and their ability to perform the services. They want to know if you're set up in their particular states that they need to work in, how you handle onboarding. They definitely want your references of clients that you've been working with. And they also definitely require the pricing. Those are the critical components you typically see in every RFP.
Perfect. Yeah. No, and I think that first one that you mentioned is maybe a good one to start sort of diving into a little bit, is the history, right? Like why, especially from a buyer's perspective, why is the history of the firm important?
Well, I think longevity is definitely a critical component of selecting your EOR. We certainly have a lot of history that involves learning and establishing your business, making sure you're compliant, and just learning all the laws and regulations. So, there's definitely EOR services out there, but they're not all the same.
Yeah.
The level of detail that go involved with the different business aspects. And also, you need to look at what type of workers the client is looking to place with the different EORs, because some EORs specialize in light industrial, some specialize in healthcare, some specialize in global placement. So it really depends on what the specific client's needs are.
Yeah, I think if you're an EOR buyer that maybe did an RFP 5 or 10 years ago, and this is your second round, that you're going to be surprised at how many more players are in the market. Julie, to your point around experience, in the last 5 years, the EOR market has really changed. And I think specifically around that point you made, Julie, global versus domestic, and more specifically, sort of two factions of EORs, and you want to differentiate for your specific use case, right? So there's this global EOR use case where it's like hiring full-time equivalent workers in other countries, right? So if you're in the US, you want to hire and manage, 50 workers that are maybe spread out across 7 different countries. A global EOR might be a great vendor for you, right? But if you're a buyer that's looking for support around maybe staffing or contingent workforce use cases, there's a totally different set of vendors that you should probably look at that do not fit the global EOR model. However, in the last 5 years, the global EOR model has taken in so much funding, probably the highest recipient that industry of venture capital in the last 5 years. Billions and billions of dollars has poured into companies like Deal, Oyster, Papaya Global, Velocity Global, those companies, which you're going to see really at the top pages of Google when you search EOR, because they're spending the most on ads. They're driving as much traffic as possible on that word, employer of record. And they're using it for their use case, which is global hiring. But historically, probably 30 years or longer ago, the EOR word and solution was built really on the contingent workforce use case first. And so those vendors are totally different than the global EORs. And so not only is there a difference there, but like you said, in tenure, a lot of those global EORs are newer, right? 5, maybe 10 years old. And so that's a completely different type of vendor than a company in the contingent space that's 30 years old, 40 years old, and has been doing this for a lot longer. So I would just be conscious of that. It's definitely important to ask that question. Don't gloss over it. And don't just check the box with that question either. Really dig in there and ask some questions around your space, like Julie said, and how much experience they have with the types of hires you want to make. But I think that's definitely a big topic to cover.
Yeah, and Colin, we do hear that come up some with compliance too, because oftentimes when you're looking for a partner for contingent staffing, one of the things you're relying on is that partner to be your guide for like those state and local laws, right? And not just around
Right.
around paying your employees. Those are kind of table stakes. It really gets into looking at things like, the meal and rest breaks, the various different licenses you might have to carry, all of the different leave types that employees may be entitled to, which can vary based on the employee's role, their pay rate, the industry. There's a lot involved there. And having somebody who focuses on contingent and really understands how all of those local requirements are going to come into play is really important, right? So especially for these bigger opportunities where they're looking for that long-term partner, somebody who's really going to remain in the driver's seat and ensure that everything's handled compliantly on their behalf.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. The compliance requirements from a contingent perspective are completely different than from a full-time equivalent perspective. I think the complexities are probably similar as far as volume of complexities. They're just completely different, right?
Right.
Hiring full-time workers.
Different expertise.
Yeah, it's just a
Yeah.
completely different conversation. There's licenses that are required. There are technology specific requirements that you might not necessarily think about. So maybe we spend some time there, right? Like, what are some of the questions, Julie, that you see around technology that you might want to call out on some of these RFPs?
Definitely, they focus on the onboarding, the EOR's capabilities to onboard the various workers. They want to know how quickly the EOR can onboard somebody. They want to know about the timekeeping platform from not just the manager's perspective, but also the worker's perspective. They obviously need to ensure that their workers are going to be working with an EOR that can meet their needs as well. They're very interested in knowing what all their employees can see in the portals. Whether that's pay stubs or if they've got the ability to make a W-4 change, if they can download their W-2s at the end of the year. What does it look like to offboard that employee as well? So the platforms, the technology are very critical to these clients. And you've got to think, especially if we're talking high volumes, the EOR needs to be able to have a tech savvy platform for those clients.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the same use case specific questions need to be asked if I'm a buyer of staffing or of EOR services, right? Global use cases, you're not even going to be considering time and attendance because paying people based on an hourly wage isn't a thing that people do in other countries necessarily, right? But in the US, especially in contingent workforce space, that's the linchpin of the entire model is hourly work, right? Those hours transition into bill rates and pay rates, right? All of that stuff is contingent upon how do we get the time data. And to your point, Julie, you need to be a tech forward vendor, in our opinion, to be able to support scalability and volume in this space because there's so many different tech platforms involved. Do you need to have an API integration capability to take in data from other systems like VMSs, right? How does your time system fit the specific use case, right? Because healthcare time and attendance is way different than just a software developer, right? Because you've got things like multi-work site, multi-pay rate, you've got shift differentials, on call, all those types of differences, which I know, Jamie, you can speak to a lot. So, I mean, if you're a buyer of EOR services in healthcare, how might you tailor your questions to the technology piece?
Yeah, so I think you just hit a lot of it, right, Colin? I think a couple things that I would add to that is not just their ability to handle those rates, but their ability to handle those types of rate changes within a given shift, right? So can an employee have a rate that increases if they work a shift that crosses from second into third shift, right? So you're going to have those kinds of things. Will it account for, how weeks split, particularly across a weekend, typically, in order to make sure that the overtime allocates appropriately from one week to the next? You're going to have one of the biggest questions that I know we often see in these RFPs is how we handle the weighted overtime average, right? So that's a big one. We know that that comes up often in healthcare. To ensure compliance, that's being handled appropriately, and it's got to be able to take into account any of those shift differentials, incentive pay that's put on to pick up extra shifts, those types of things. So it can get pretty complicated, and that's definitely an area where we see healthcare buyers in particular really want to dig in and have a deep understanding of what your capabilities are.
And if you're not a healthcare buyer, or maybe you just want to learn more about this, what is weighted overtime average exactly?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's one that's a little tricky to understand, right? But basically, when you're calculating overtime, it's not as simple as 1.5 times the standard rate of pay when you have multiple rates of pay that have to be factored in, right? So that example we just talked about with the employee who works part of their shift during second shift and is making, let's say, $30 an hour. Well, they probably make something like 33.50 for third shift. So the hours that are worked during second shift are paid at one rate, the hours for third shift are paid at another. And then to complicate things more, let's say that employee picked up an extra shift on a Saturday to, help out the floor they're working on. And with that, they're making an extra, $10 an hour during that shift. All of those additional rate types have to be factored into the overtime. So it's not just 1.5 times that, $30 pay rate that we discussed as their standard for their second shift hours. It's all of those rates and the average of those rates with the hours worked that determine what should be the weighted overtime average. So it would look different from one week to the next as far as what they were paid for any hours worked as overtime, depending upon how many hours they worked at each of those different rate types. You also have to take into account things like bonuses that are given for certain different types of reasons, right? So those discretionary and non-discretionary bonuses are looked at differently when you're taking into account the overtime rate, and they have to be accounted for as well.
Yeah, that can get very complex, right? And I think even by geography, right? And I think that's another area that people take for granted is like, yeah, EORs just all do everywhere. It's not necessarily true, right? So some of these rules around pay rates and time differences can also vary by geography based off of different overtime rules in cities or states or counties. So, Julie, what are
Yeah.
some of the questions you see around geography, if any?
Some of them, what you just mentioned, Colin, some of them will specifically ask if we have done business in X, Y, and Z states. As you mentioned, there are several states that have daily overtime laws. California, Colorado, Alaska. California even has double time rules. So a lot of those domestic here in the United States, EOR RFPs are definitely going to ask if you've got experience placing in those particular states because they want to make sure that you are correctly applying those laws and
Yep.
keep them compliant as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to make sure that the states you're going to hire in the EOR can support them and are familiar with those laws. California and Illinois, New York, those states are really difficult. But if you're looking for a global EOR, same thing, right? And one of the questions you want to ask from a global perspective is, do you have your own entity in those locations or do you use partners? It's going to change the workflow. It's going to change the control and access you have to those workers through the EOR. I know it's an important question a lot of global EOR buyers ask. So if that's your skew on this whole conversation, that would be an important question to ask as well. Along with some of the financial stuff, which does differ from a global and contingent perspective. So where do you usually see, Julie, the questions starting from a financial perspective?
Well, I think that the price is the biggest thing. They want to know what your pricing is going to be, whether that's traditional hourly pricing or if it's a percentage of the pay or if it's a fixed monthly. They want to know that. They want to know if they're going to get any sort of a volume discount through the EOR, if you give them certain, quantities. They also sometimes will ask if they would get an early payment discount if they are quick to pay. So those are all questions that we do see from a financial perspective, but they also ask a lot of questions about the EOR's financial stability. They want to know like what their annual revenue is. Some of them do go so far as to ask for financial statements just to vet the financial health of that EOR for
Yep.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all those things are definitely important things that you could ask if you wanted to. Not sure if you're going to get all that information from every EOR, if they're comfortable sharing that stuff. Some of them could be publicly traded, so, so it's all public. Some of them could be private organizations, maybe not as willing to share, but those are all important. I think the main question around the price point, though, a lot of times centers around the model. And so a lot of buyers aren't familiar with the different models that exist, and they think one way because they see things on one vendor's website that maybe they don't see on another, and they just go with one, right? So it's important to understand how the models work. So I'll start with what people typically see online when they're searching for pricing models, which is a flat monthly price point. Okay, that model works really well for global EOR because most foreign countries outside the United States pay their workers in those countries on a monthly pay cycle, right? So once a month they get paid, so therefore it's calculated one time. A monthly fee is charged and sent to the client. Works really well from a timing perspective and fits that model. And when they're saying, hey, we're going to charge you, let's call it $700 a month per employee, right? They're saying they're going to charge you that amount on top of the gross payroll plus statutory costs. And they don't usually include that information in the numbers they're showing online, right? And that payroll plus statutory costs before the fee, right? That number a lot of times is variable based off of the different tax codes and things that are pulled out of the pay to support whatever it might be, like retirement plans or benefits, or there's all types of different taxes that are applied in other countries that we're maybe not familiar with. Like example, like in Ireland, there's a church tax. If you're hiring in Ireland for the first time, you have no idea about that, right? And a lot of that stuff can vary even over the course of the year as you hit certain tax caps, right? So when you're looking at a global EOR charging a monthly model, right, you need to be aware that the payroll and statutory is variable, but the fee, the $700 a month or whatever the number is flat. And it's charged once a month. That works really well for that model because these are full-time equivalents, right? Now, on the contingent side, the model is totally different. It's an hourly based model because typically this is in a staffing environment, right? And that hourly based model is based off the hours worked multiplied by the pay rate. And then the EOR typically charges a percentage of that pay rate as the fee to cover the statutory costs, which we explained in the global EOR model, and their fee in one. And that works well, the percentage of payroll in the contingent market, because we, as vendors, we don't know how many hours they're going to work and what their payroll is going to be every month because it depends on how many hours they work. And since it's a contingent-based model, the monthly fee doesn't really work well because if they don't work a lot of hours, you want to pay this large monthly fee for a little tiny bit of hours, right? So, and vice versa, a vendor doesn't want to make a tiny little bit of money on a large number of payroll because there's a lot of costs associated with that, like lending fees and taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So those are important distinctions. So if I'm a buyer of these services, I'm expecting, if I'm buying for contingent use case in the US, I'm going to expect a percentage of pay model or something close to that. If I'm buying on a global use case model for full-time equivalent workers, I'm expecting a flat monthly fee model. So you definitely want to ask those questions up front, and you shouldn't expect one or the other from those vendors if if your use case isn't aligned there. And understanding that I think is important. Yeah, so financials a big area. One of the other areas that I think are important is insurance. Julie, what are some of the questions you see around insurance?
They definitely want to see your certificate of insurance. So plan that you're going to have to give that one. They want to know what limits you carry, and that's going to vary based on the market that client works in. For instance, if they're heavy into IT, they're going to want to ensure that you've carried the cyber liability insurance.
Right.
If they happen to be one that works in, let's say, the oil producing fields, exporting oils, they're going to be heavy into workers' comp and longshoreman insurance. If they are in the healthcare space, they're going to want to ensure that you've got maybe medical malpractice insurance or something that's going to cover that exposure there. If they're in the educational space, they might require you to carry like sexual molestation insurance. So it really also is driven based on the market that the individual clients are in. But they're definitely going to want to see your certificate of insurance in that RFP.
Yep. Yeah. And a lot of times that's to meet requirements from their customers, right? If it's, maybe not a public institution, but they're passing through stuff from their customers to you that you're going to have to cover with your insurance policy. So if you're a buyer, you definitely want to ask for the certificate of insurance to see where those limits are at, to make sure that you're comfortable with the coverage level that the vendor has, because ultimately, employer of record, they are the employer of your workers. And so you want to make sure that those workers are going to be covered by the proper insurance levels. Yeah, those are the main areas. I think, did I miss anything, Julie? Any other main areas you see questions come in for EOR services?
I mean, I think we see a lot in the history category. It's not uncommon for them to want to know the history of not only the EOR, but also the key employees that'll be servicing that account. It's not uncommon for them to ask for copies of key personnel resumes. They want to dig in and see not only about the organization, but also about the employees within the organization to make sure that that EOR, really does have access to the valuable resources that are essential to support that client's business.
Yep. Yeah, I think those are majorly important. When you think about especially larger volume opportunities, you're going to want a dedicated person or people to support your account. Certain service levels that you should expect from a response time perspective, things like that. So not surprised by some of those questions. What are some of the questions that you get that maybe don't make sense, that seem irrelevant, or that maybe could scare off a vendor that a buyer doesn't want to scare off?
Ah, boy, I'd have to think about that one. I mean, we do see a lot of scenario type questions of like potentially, okay, you've got this scenario, how would you handle it? And it's not that they're not relevant, but it does take a lot of thought that goes into that. And it kind of makes you wonder, oh, well, what has this client experienced that could be causing them to ask that question? I mean, we've heard some interesting stories along the way. Things do happen. So I don't want to say they're like irrelevant questions, but they kind of make you wonder. And how we as an EOR would respond to that if we were in that particular case. So it does make you think.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen some repetition of questions too, which is interesting, especially when the RFP itself is well organized and broken down by, sections, either by like topic or department. And we'll see the same question referenced across multiple departments, or, even included in separate spaces, but worded just slightly different. And so that's always a little interesting. You always kind of ask yourself if they're expecting different departments to answer that separately. Whereas I know, when we respond, we try to give cohesive responses. So, if a question needs to come from both finance and compliance and HR, we try to give one answer from all areas. And so that can be a little challenging sometimes when you see the repetition of the questions. And then the other thing that we've encountered more recently, or more frequently recently, I should say, is questions that then when we reach out for clarification, whether it be around things like data security or specific insurance limits, things of that nature, they'll tell us that it doesn't necessarily apply. And so that can also, that can be a little bit misleading sometimes, because then it just leads you to wonder if there's other questions that maybe don't apply as well. So,
Right.
yeah, definitely.
Like legal got a hand in this RFP request, and then all of a sudden there's all these questions. You're like, what are these for? And the buyer group is like, I don't know what they're for. They don't really matter. So
right. Exactly.
So that definitely happens a lot. I think also one thing to call out is, a lot of times, especially in contingent workforce use cases, there are other parties involved in the buyer equation that might impact the experience of the vendor and the buyer that need to be, included in the question and answer. Specifically, I would call out like third-party involvement from MSP providers, I think is important, or VMS systems that you'd expect a vendor to use. You definitely want to ask questions like, do you have experience? Are you willing to work with these types of vendors? How does it change our relationship, right? Because those vendors typically are taking a piece off the top for their costs. It's, vendor supported model. Is the EOR going to be considered a vendor? Are their prices going to be impacted by that? VMS or MSP fee, right? All of those things I think are important. And to be frank, that could cause some vendors to maybe take a pause and say, I don't know if we want to work with this or not, for a number of reasons, whether those be technological or contractual that they may not be comfortable with. So call that out. If you're a buyer, definitely ask some questions around that. If you're thinking about maybe plugging in a new EOR or an EOR for the first time into a program that already has MSP involvement, I think it's a very important thing to call out.
Yeah, and Colin, to add on to that too, I think taking it a step further and asking about any specific VMS integrations or ability to integrate with VMSs, and not just VMSs, but we see it with ATSs as well, right? So like, that integration piece is becoming increasingly more a focus.
Yes.
And similarly, we've seen questions around background screening providers. So request to be able to use a specific provider is something that we often see. And while that's a great request, I would encourage anybody who's looking to develop an RFP maybe to ask who the prospective EORs use as their vendor and what that experience has been like, what their pricing is like, et cetera, because there are so many options out there. It's an opportunity to explore, if there's a better fit as well.
Yep, absolutely. There are systems and processes set up by EORs to create scale and automation. And if you're looking for them to plug and play your preferred vendors in those spots, it can cause some disruption around their delivery and change how they might be able to service your account. So calling that out early is important. I also think, from an onboarding perspective, you are looking at contingent use cases. How is the onboarding done? Is it done internally, externally? Are they using a partner? Is that partner onshore, offshore? I think a lot of that can impact the onboarding experience of your workers, which is very important. So asking questions around that would definitely serve you well in the buyer's perspective. So that is a long list of questions we would recommend considering, or at least areas. If you're interested in doing an EOR RFP, or you're like trying to explore how do you get started, we do have a tool that you can use. We'll put it in the comments, an EOR RFP toolkit. It is built for contingent EOR use cases. So if you're looking for global, this is probably not the right toolkit for you. You can certainly download it and tailor it to your needs. So go ahead and look in the comments for that. Otherwise, hope you found this valuable. We'll see you next time on How to Get Away with Staffing. Thanks.